Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. When the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, all 48 states played a role in war mobilization and made unique contributions that reflected their histories, their politics, their natural resources and industries, and their military manpower. We have explored the roles of a couple of states in previous episodes. Viewing the war through these state-level prisms adds a very interesting layer to our understanding of World War I. Today, our focus is Kansas, a midwestern state that provided approximately 80,000 troops, and if not for his premature death, may also have provided its adopted son, Fighting Fred Funston, as commander of the AEF instead of John J. Pershing. To discuss Kansas and World War I, we are joined by Blake Watson, author of Kansas and Kansans in World War I. Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. I enjoy reading and talking and discussing World War I with people.
Well, this is the perfect podcast for you then. So tell us a little about Kansas leading up to World War I.
The reason I picked Kansas is because I have a personal connection. And one of the things I found when I researched Kansas during World War I, and I'm sure this is true for all other states, is at that time period, there was so much information available in small town newspapers. And one of the things I was able to do was create a snapshot of Kansas, and I present that in the first chapter. Prior to World War I, Topeka, Wichita, and Kansas City were the only three cities in the state with more than 20,000 residents. And there were just 9 towns with populations between 10 and 20,000 people. So it was a small town dominated state. And as you might expect, being Kansas, wheat farming and agriculture predominated, but oil and gas production was becoming quite important in the southern part of the state. 2 Kansans at that time, Clyde Cessna and Walter Chrysler, were establishing themselves as leading figures in the aviation and automobile industries. Another historical figure, Carrie Nation, lived in Medicine Lodge, Kansas, where she started her temperance movement. And Kansas was one of the first states to prohibit alcohol consumption. In 1912, prior to World War I, the state granted women the right to vote 8 years before the 19th Amendment. And overall, Kansas had about 1.7 million inhabitants in 1917. Of that total, about 3% were African American and less than 1% were Native American.
So we know that support for involvement in a European war was not universal in the United States, especially in the pre-1917 period. You write that prior to 1917, Kansas was one of the least receptive states to the idea of a European war. Why was this? And then when war is declared, does this attitude change?
I was a bit surprised to find the opposition pre-war in Kansas to be so strong. I think the average Kansan was very patriotic, but was skeptical about the need to get involved in what was perceived as a European war. That was definitely true with respect to the governor of Kansas, Arthur Capper, a Republican who opposed the war prior to our entry. We also have to remember that there were many Kansans who were ethnic Germans. When Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, his victory in Kansas came as a very large surprise, but his promise to keep America out of the war appealed to many Kansans, including women voters. As a man from Pittsburgh, Kansas, said after the election, "We Republicans gave women of Kansas the ballot, and they used it against us on Tuesday." Things definitely changed, however, with the German submarine warfare that forced the hand of President Woodrow Wilson and the United States. Kansas immediately accepted the claim that America's entry into the war was needed to make the world safe for democracy. There was very little opposition to the war after April of 1917. One exception concerned members of the Mennonite Church in Kansas. who held conscientious objections to warfare in general. But many Mennonite men who were drafted did accept non-combat roles in the military.
I totally forgot that Kansas, I think, what was it, 1913, 1912, women get the right to vote?
Yeah, they were ahead of the United States in general, both in terms of prohibition, but also in, I suppose, more progressively in terms of the ability of women to vote. And they definitely exercised it. And historians believe it did make an impact in the 1916 election.
Okay. Wow. Wow. I didn't know that. Okay. So after war is declared, the National Guard is federalized. And what can you tell us about the Kansas National Guard and how prepared were its units for World War One?
This was really my first focus in my research because of a personal connection, a great uncle who was in the Kansas National Guard. And I spent a lot of time looking at the Kansas National Guard. So I'm not an expert on National Guards in other states, but based on my research, I do believe the Kansas National Guard was relatively well prepared to participate in the warfare going on in Europe. One advantage that Kansans had was the fact that the state is the home of Fort Riley and also Fort Leavenworth. And those are two major posts of the United States Army. So prior to World War One, the Kansas National Guard officers would often go to Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth and participate in training exercises conducted by regular Army officers. Another factor is that the Kansas National Guard was quite receptive to being organized with the same command structure as the United States Army. So that made the transition easier as well. In 1916, of course, prior to World War I, the Kansas National Guard was sent to the Texas border, as was many other National Guard units, in order to protect the American citizens from possible attack against Pancho Villa and other Mexicans. And there was no attack at that time at that place. However, the training exercise and the experience was positive, and the Assistant Chief of Staff of the United States Army praised the two Kansas regiments that were sent, declaring them to be among the four best regiments that were on the border in 1916.
So, like many other states, Kansas hosts military training camps during the war. Tell us about Camp Funston.
Camp Funston was built in 1917 near Fort Riley, which is not far from Junction City and Manhattan, Kansas, in the middle part of the state. The camp was named, as you mentioned at the outset, in honor of General Frederick Funston, Fighting Fred. He was a Kansan who died very unexpectedly in February of 1917. And as you mentioned, some historians believe that given his rank and experience at the time, he would have been named as the commander of the American troops if he had lived instead of General John Pershing. If you go to Kansas today and you go to Fort Riley, you'll see little or no trace of Camp Funston, which basically was a wooden city that was hastily constructed and easily dismantled. But at the time, it had a population that rivaled the size of Topeka. I want to share, if I may, with a letter with the audience written by an out-of-state soldier about his stay in Kansas. I'll quote it. No pretty women, no shower bath, no poker, no people, no fun, no joy, no nothing, save heat and blistering sun and scorching winds and sweat and dust and thirst and loud and stifling nights and working all hours with lonesomeness and general hell. Apparently, he was not a fan of Camp Funston. Many Kansans went to Camp Funston, including my own paternal grandfather, Thomas Watson, who was sent in the summer of 1918 and somehow avoided the Spanish flu, which was quite prevalent at the time. Most of these Kansas draftees were put in the 353rd Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 89th Division stationed at Camp Funston. The 89th saw in Europe significant action at both Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918, and then also during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in November. So I want to compare the 89th, if I may, with the 92nd. The 89th Division trained at Camp Funston as an intact unit. In contrast, the 92nd Infantry Division was split up and sent all over the country, and only parts of the 92nd trained in Kansas. There's a simple but sad explanation for the differing treatment. The 92nd was one of the two African American fighting divisions in the Great War, and people in the United States did not want Black soldiers to be concentrated in one area. There was quite strong opposition to the 92nd Division being trained in Kansas by local officials, including at the time the acting president of the Kansas State Agricultural College, which is now Kansas State University. I discussed the treatment of Black soldiers at Camp Funston in one of the chapters. As noted by an African American, the white and Black soldiers of the 89th and 92nd were kept apart by, quote, an imaginary line, yet a thoroughly distinct one, end quote. The 92nd Division was commanded by a white man, General Charles Ballou. In March of 1918, he instructed his men against doing anything, no matter how legally correct, that will provoke race animosity. He also told his soldiers to attend quietly and faithfully to your duties and do not go where your presence is not desired. The general's orders were not mentioned at all in the local newspapers, but these orders were strongly criticized in Black focused newspapers in other cities, such as Topeka and Kansas City, and as far away as New York City. According to a Black Kansan, Fred Carson, who went to France and then returned, his experience was recounted as follows. From the time I left Camp Funston until I returned for my discharge, I would not have known that I was colored. But he then added, only when I got to Funston was there any distinction made.
Interesting. Now, at the MacArthur Memorial, we're very familiar with the 117th Ammunition Train because it was part of General Douglas MacArthur's beloved 42nd Division. And I believe that was a Kansas unit, the Kansas National Guard 1st Ammunition Train. So they're supposedly the first Kansas unit in France and the last to come home, correct? Why don't you tell us about them?
That is correct. And in my research, it was enjoyable to also see the experiences of Douglas MacArthur with the 42nd as he rose in his ranks and his experiences that he had during World War I, which obviously clearly prepared him quite nicely for the rest of his career. So the 117th Ammunition Train of the 42nd Rainbow Division did come from Kansas, and I talk about that particular unit in a separate chapter. The Rainbow Division was created by taking parts of National Guard units from 26 states and the District of Columbia. And so this idea of spanning the United States like a rainbow is the reason apparently for the nickname for the 42nd. The idea of creating an infantry division composed of men from all over the country was a pretty smart move because it enabled the U.S. Army to avoid being accused of favoritism when it deployed the 42nd to France. And as it turned out, as we've said, the contribution to this 42nd Division from Kansas was its ammunition train. And the ammunition train was responsible for supplying the infantry and artillery with bullets and shells. Many of the men who were part of the ammunition train came from the Kansas City area, both on the Kansas and Missouri side. And if you go to Kansas City, Kansas today, you will find that one of the main streets is called Rainbow Boulevard. The 42nd Division was one of the very first divisions in France, arriving about the same time as the 26th Division, another National Guard unit, and the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the regular Army. Although not an infantry unit, the 117th Ammunition Train did suffer its share of casualties. 2 American Legion posts and 1 VFW post in Kansas are named in honor of Kansans in the 117th who were killed by aerial bombing while hauling ammunition. And after the armistice, the 117th went with the rest of the 42nd Division into Belgium and Luxembourg. According to the Kansas City Star newspaper, the 117th Ammunition Train was the last unit in Kansas to come home. And according to the paper, the 117th did not suffer a single arrest for misconduct while in Europe. Certainly, the first part of that statement is true, but I can't confirm the second part about the lack of misconduct.
Yeah, that would be pretty miraculous, probably, if it was true. But no, not a bad record to have in the newspaper. So you've talked a little bit about the 89th Division, the 92nd Division, and apart from the 117th Ammunition Train, it seems that Kansans are present in most of the major battles that the AEF is involved in. What other units are associated with Kansas, and where do they fight?
Kansans were, I think, as every other state, found in virtually all parts of the military, of course. They were in the Navy, they were in the Marines. Some were drafted, some enlisted, some joined the National Guard. But in addition to the 117th, there were really three other units that we can say were focused on Kansas, and they were infantry regiments. So the other three, two of them were in what is the 35th Infantry Division. The rest of the Kansas National Guard, other than the ammunition train, ended up joining with the Missouri National Guard to form the 35th Infantry Division. In particular, in that division, most Kansans served in the 139th and the 137th Infantry Regiments. And that would include my great uncle, Ralph Nichols, who was a private in Company B of the 139th. He was shot through the cheek during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but survived and returned to Oskaloosa, Kansas, a very small town, where in 1919 and 1920 he completed his senior year of high school. Another regiment that was not part of the 35th that is associated with Kansas is, and I mentioned them earlier, the 353rd Regiment, which was part of the 89th Division that had trained at Camp Funston. These men were, for the most part, drafted. The 353rd is sometimes called the All Kansas Regiment, although it was never composed entirely of Kansans. And in fact, one prominent notable exception as a member of this division was a very famous baseball player, Grover Cleveland Alexander from Nebraska, who served in the artillery in the 89th Division.
Can you highlight the service of a few soldiers from Kansas?
Boy, absolutely. This is really the heart of my book, was the ability to find stories about people who served and how they served. And so there's so many interesting stories. I'm going to try to limit myself to three, and I'll try to be concise, but there's a lot of information about these men and other men that I was able to uncover. So the first that I thought would be of interest is a man by the name of Frank Jeffords from Kansas City. Frank served in Company A of the 137th Regiment, and he served with his younger brother, Paul. On the 28th of September, during the initial days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Paul was killed in action, and Frank was a victim of mustard gas. Their parents in Kansas were told that both of their sons were dead. And when Frank sent mail home from his hospital, for some reason, the mail was not delivered. In fact, his parents were instructed to claim his life insurance. All of this was unknown to Frank, who did not arrive in the United States until April of 1919. When he arrived, he called his mother by telephone and said something to the effect, "Just landed at Hoboken, and mother, am I anxious to get home?" His mother replied by saying, "Who is this?" To which he replied, "Why, it's Frank. Didn't you get my letters?" So this was quite a shock. Later the same year, the brother Paul was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism. And as for Frank Jeffords, who suffered from poor lungs for the remainder of his life, he was a man who lived to be of age 88 and did not pass away until 1986. So that's a story that in part reflects the difficulties of communication which plagued the Army at that time, and some of the stories about false statements of death that were prevalent at that time as well. My second story features George Mallon. Mallon was someone who was in the Army for most of his life, and in 1901, he was the United States Army boxing champion in the Philippine Islands. It was 17 years later, when he was 40 years old, that he led his men into battle on September 26, 1918. At one point, he encounters a German officer and knocks the German officer out with a strong right hand to the chin. By the end of the day, Mallon and his 10 men captured almost 100 Germans and seized 11 machine guns. For his heroism, Mallon was personally awarded the Medal of Honor by General John Pershing. And in my book, you'll find a drawing of Mallon punching the German officer. It was part of an advertising campaign in the United States to sell war bonds. And below the drawing of Mallon are the words, "He fought for you in the regular American way, two-fisted and hard-hitting. Lend here as Mallon fought there." The third story that I find interesting and want to share is about a man named Martin Bender. He was a lawyer from Holton, Kansas, a small town in northeast Kansas. Like Mallon, Bender was in his 40s when he went to France. But Bender was not a soldier. He was a musician, and he played the alto saxophone. Bender and some of his friends from northeast Kansas volunteered in 1917 to become a Marine regimental band. They were accepted by the Marines and trained as Marines and were assigned to the 6th Marine Regiment, which many people know by special arrangement at that time served as part of the 2nd U.S. Army Division. The Marines of the 5th and the 6th regiments became famous in June of 1918 for their heroism and sacrifice during the Battle of Belleau Wood. During that horrific fight, Martin Bender and his fellow musicians put down their instruments, picked up stretchers, and carried many, many men off the battlefield. About half of these musicians were gassed, mostly mustard gas. At one point, Bender and another musician carried a Marine for about 200 yards, according to Bender, in plain view of the Germans. As he recalled, they didn't shoot us because they saw our red crosses on our arms. After the war, Martin Bender returned to Kansas, where he was elected to serve in the state legislature and also as a state judge. So these, I think, are 3 examples of what you might call average Kansans doing extraordinary things.
And I thought it was interesting in your book that, you talk about all of these average Kansans, but if you're interested in World War I, it's Belleau Wood, it's the Champagne Marne, it's the Aisne Marne, it's Saint Mihiel, it's Meuse-Argonne. It's like almost anywhere that Americans are fighting, they're always there, like you said. So do we know how many soldiers from Kansas were killed during the war?
According to one account that I found, approximately 80,000 Kansans served, and that account suggests that about 8%, which would be roughly 6,500, were lost either to combat, accidents, or disease. There's a good database that you can find online that describes the fatalities that were part of the Kansas Army units. The primary causes of death not directly related to combat were influenza and pneumonia, mostly associated with the Spanish flu pandemic. And some historians believe that Spanish flu worldwide pandemic actually originated in western Kansas and was brought to Camp Funston. And then when the soldiers were dispatched to Europe, it helped spread the influenza.
You've begun to touch a little bit on the home front in a sense. So how does the home front contribute to the war effort besides these military training camps?
That's definitely part of the story. And I spend 2 chapters discussing the home front, both in 1917 and how it evolved in 1918, and 2 additional chapters talking about how Kansans dealt with the aftermath of the war. I think for the most part, I believe Kansans reacted like people from other states. They did have a stronger opposition, but that opposition very quickly turned to support once the war was declared. And a large number of men from Kansas either joined the National Guard or enlisted in the U.S. Army, Marines, or Navy rather than wait to be drafted. Kansans, like other people, bought war bonds. They worked hard, particularly in their state, to increase wheat production, and they agreed to abstain from foods that were in short supply. Universities in Kansas, that would be Washburn College, the University of Kansas, Kansas State, and others, incorporated officer training. This is when ROTC began, for example. Both men and women volunteered for the Red Cross and the YMCA. Those two organizations were very prominent in helping soldiers and also prisoners of war. But at the same time, we have to remember that ethnic Germans in Kansas, as elsewhere, were subjected to harassment and mistreatment. Non-citizens of German heritage were fingerprinted and called alien enemies, even at the same time as their sons and husbands and nephews, etc., were fighting for the United States. During this time in Kansas, yellow paint was used as a weapon to coerce people to contribute to the war cause, and in some cases to punish people who were viewed as not sufficiently patriotic. When the war ended, Kansans erected numerous statues and monuments in small towns and larger towns as well. Kansas State and the University of Kansas both built football stadiums to honor the service and sacrifices made during the war. And just across the state line in Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri, the war was commemorated with sculptures and buildings that today are a part of our National World War I Museum and Memorial.
Can you describe what they did with the yellow paint? Is this something they throw on your business or throw on a person? How did that happen?
That's exactly right. You're right in both circumstances. I found examples, and again, this is where the small town newspapers were so helpful in my research. There were definitely examples of, in some cases, individuals having yellow paint placed on them, sort of as I guess, shameful an attempt to shame them, I should say, but also on their cars or their buildings. And it was so prominent that in one example, a newspaper went so far as to explain that yellow paint that was in the lobby of a particular building in that town, the newspaper said, no, this isn't anything about not being patriotic. This is because one of the employees of the building spilled yellow paint. So they were so concerned that people would associate it with lack of patriotism that they felt they had to explain what was really just an accident. But this was, I think, an example of a larger issue that certainly was part of our World War I history, and that was the concern about the enemy within and the response, which in some respects perhaps went overboard in retrospect, the abridgment of civil liberties and freedom of speech, which certainly, again, took place in Kansas as it did elsewhere in the United States.
Final thoughts. What is Kansas's World War I legacy?
I want to think about what perhaps distinguished Kansans. And again, as I think I've said several times, the heroism of the average Kansan, I think, is something that every other state can point to with respect to their citizens and can be proud of. So I don't know if it's particularly distinctive in that respect, but I want to point out that Kansans can be proud of the fact that its state contributed what I believe is more than its share of military leaders in World War I. I have three examples of very prominent leaders. James Harbald commanded the 2nd Division at Belleau Wood, and he also served as General Pershing's chief of staff. He was considered to be a potential successor to Pershing if, in fact, Pershing had died during World War I. A second Kansan, Colonel Ulysses Grant McAlexander, his regiment held off the Germans at a critical point during the Second Battle of the Marne, and this earned him the nickname the Rock of the Marne, a nickname which has also been applied to his regiment and as well to the 3rd Division as a whole. And then finally, Clarence Hubner, a Kansan from a small town who began World War I as a lieutenant. He ended World War I in charge of his regiment. And in the Second World War, Hubner would take command of the entire 1st Division. and helped that division when it returned to France on D-Day at Omaha Beach in 1944. So all three of these men are from small Kansas towns, quite small, less than 1,000 people in a couple instances. Two of the men, Harbaugh and Hubner, enlisted as privates and retired as generals. I think Kansans should be proud of the service of these men as well as of the citizens of the state who accepted the call and participated both in the home front and also on the battlefield.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to share with us about Kansas and World War I. And the book is Kansas and Kansans in World War I. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.